When there is a game that is so successful that it not only does incredibly well, but also helps define the genre and is held as a measuring point for other games in that genre, it is not uncommon for the developer to decide to release a sequel, both from the player-based stand of view as well as the marketing point of view. Such was the case with the Amnesia series, the first one, The Dark Descent, which is widely praised as a fantastic horror game, which inspired many others in the similar genre of running, hiding, and all the gist of survival horror. Now back in 2013, the Chinese room hoped they would achieve similar results with the sequel, The Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs. Now unfortunately, this was not entirely the case, and as most of the player base sees it, The Machine for Pigs does not work as a successful sequel. That's not to say it's not a good game whatsoever. Looking back at it now, it scored solid reviews all over the board, ranging from about 7 out of 10 on Edge, all the way up to 89 out of 100 on PC Gamer US. The question, however, remains, why does the player base view this game as only mediocre and not a successful and functional sequel to the masterpiece of Dark Descent? Well, today I am going to look at exactly why Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs was not a successful sequel. The answer to this one might actually surprise you because, contrary to many of my videos, I will be trying a slightly different approach in this one. Rather than listing out the mechanics, dynamics, and aesthetics, the MDA model, the 8 kinds of fun, all that stuff that I usually bring up, in this one I will mostly be focusing on the player base and why they did not receive the game as well as the developer intended. To help structurize this video, I will be focusing on 2 main categories: the player expectation and game marketing, both of which contribute heavily to my argument. So let's start from the top with player expectations on what a sequel should technically do. If you went out and asked players on what they think a sequel should be classified as, you will get many different answers, obviously. There will, however, be things that reoccur through all the answers, which I think we can use to generalize the answer to the question. In most cases, a sequel should iterate, improve on, and expand on what the first game did so well, right? You should always analyze what made the initial release great, take that, and innovate and improve on the rest. So the question is, does The Machine for Pigs do this? The answer is, unfortunately, no. Let me give you an example here. In Amnesia: The Dark Descent, there is a very prevalent lantern mechanic. You have your oil-fueled lantern, for which you need to collect oil in order to be able to see in the many dark areas of the game. Now compare this to A Machine for Pigs, in which your lantern is electronic, I think, and hence does not require you to gather oil for it. In fact, it does not require you to gather anything whatsoever. Now you might see this as them removing a single mechanic and simplifying, which in general can be a part of what sequels do. However, what you might not realize up front is that they're not only stripping one mechanic, they're actually stripping 2, the latter of which is very major, and that being the overall darkness. In The Dark Descent, you had to manage your oil and your lantern because many of the game's areas combined with the sanity system would pretty much make Daniel go nuts unless you use the light to shine your way through. So essentially, in what seems to be a single mechanic simplification is actually removing 3 separate mechanics, the one of the oil gathering, the darkness, as well as your sanity. And when it comes to successful sequels, the point shouldn't be to scrap and simplify on everything. It should be to gather what was good about the first game and improve on the rest. So by cutting so many mechanics, you are already ridding yourself of content. You are ridding yourself of what players expect from a survival horror when they get in. And while I simply picked the lantern as an example, there are actually many more mechanics which got stripped in a similar fashion. But let's move on from this example. The second thing which I mentioned is incredibly important in the player base receiving a sequel is the game marketing. So let's look into that. When it comes to marketing and creating the initial impression your players will get even before stepping into the game, the release date and the trailers you put out before the game is released are some of the most important things. Now, there are two general mentalities in video games when it comes to release dates. You can either take the, I'm gonna call it Bethesdian approach, because this is coming from an interview with Todd Howard, who said that they like to announce a game very close to its release. If you look at the example of Fallout, it was announced only a few months before the actual game came out. Now, the reasoning as into why they do this is to avoid overhype. And so when they show the players something they should be excited about, they will be able to get their hands on it fairly quickly. Now, the second approach is kind of the opposite. You announce the game way before its release, allowing the entire hype to bubble and bloat, and your game to pretty much blow up even before it came out. Now, there is no real telling which one of these is better, or which one of these has more successful results. The game developer always has to estimate whether the game is good enough to make it through the overhype and not fail. So I suppose you could say the second method is a lot more risky. We've seen some examples of it failing majorly. Just look at the whole No Man's Sky fiasco. So how did Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, do it? Well, they chose to go with the more dangerous route. The first trailers and announcements came back in June 2012, over a year before the actual game released. Now, if this were an independent game, it might not be such an issue. However, when you are creating a sequel to something as successful as the Amnesia, The Dark Descent, you have to understand that players will naturally overhype it and get excited for its release. None of this would be a problem if it weren't for the approach that Frictional Games and the Chinese Room decided to take with this Amnesia. Quote from Frictional Games: "Originally, we thought it would be a short experimental game set in the universe of Amnesia, but the Chinese Room had a vision which was bigger than that. What we ended up with is no longer what we had first imagined, but a fully fledged Amnesia game. A different kind of Amnesia, but definitely not a short experiment." Now, the reason why this is problematic is that this explanation came out after the game's release had been delayed. So as a game developer, you pretty much announce your game and allow all of this hype for it to build, only to then come out and say that it will be a different kind of Amnesia with multiple experimental features. They were pretty much setting themselves up for sort of a failure at release, considering that what they planned to do with the game changed. They could not have possibly met the expectations that had been built up to that point by the over a year-long trailer releases, picture releases, and screenshots. And this is where it all ties together: the player expectations and the game marketing. And it results in what is, in my opinion, the thing that hurt A Machine for Pigs the most, which is its branding. Comparing The Dark Descent and its sequel is almost impossible, as they both base their core gameplay on something completely different. In A Machine for Pigs, we replace the jump scares for psychological horror, a lot more storytelling, and trying to immerse the player in its world. We don't get too many monster encounters or terrifying gory scenes. It tries to get the player to think about their actions and about how their character is progressing through the world. And that is why, by naming the game Amnesia, by selecting yourself under that brand, you are already undermining and killing yourself, because the player expectations are going to be completely off from what you intend to do with the game. That is why the video game critics who took their time to analyze this game are giving it solid ratings, but the player base views it as a bad sequel, because technically it shouldn't be a sequel. If this game was a standalone horror title released by the Chinese Room and Frictional Games, it would most likely do a lot better, because it wouldn't have the pre-given expectation that comes with an Amnesia release. So, let's recap. Why was Amnesia: A Machine for Pigs not a successful sequel? Well, the two most important parts are, number one, the player expectations. Rather than following the usual sequel format of taking the already functional core of your original game and iterating and improving and expanding on your other mechanics, they decided to scrap and simplify a huge number of them and focus on creating ones that were not even present in the original release. And secondly, they decided to go with the bold strategy of announcing the game early, letting the hype build, but then by changing the core loop of the game, yet still remaining under the Amnesia brand, sort of shot themselves in the foot, and in the end ended up creating something that might even be a good horror game, but in the eyes of the players and fans of the original, does not work well as a sequel. And that is all I have to say in the video, guys. Like I said, in my eyes, A Machine for Pigs is definitely not a bad game. The way for me to enjoy it the most though, is to forget that it's supposed to be an Amnesia title and think of it as its own separate thing, a psychological horror game. I would love to hear your guys' opinion on this down in the comments. Did you like the Machine for Pigs? Did you not like it? And if you did you personally think it was a successful sequel? And if so, maybe try elaborating onto it. I would love to start an interesting conversation like this in the comments and talk to you guys about what you thought of this game. That is it for me. I wish you all a beautiful rest of today, and I'm going to see all of you in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.
I admire your vision, I truly do. But there are surely not enough pigs in the whole of London to feed the appetite of such a machine.
That all rather depends, Professor, on what one considers to be a pig.